Welcome, everyone. And can you all hear me all right? Raise your hand if you can't. Oh, you can't hear? So the First Friday Forum team is so happy to see you all here, whether in person or online. And we look forward greatly to hearing Tom Boyce speak about the silent child. And he's a Professor Emeritus of Pediatrics and Psychiatry at UCSF, and will be unlocking the science of sensitive kids. And I see lots of parents, grandparents, teachers. I know this is a subject we're all interested in. Believe it or not, this is our 24th season, and this is sponsored by Lafayette-Orinda Presbyterian Church. My name is Sue Farmer, and I'm a part of the First Friday Forum team. Just a few housekeeping notes. Most of you know that the exits are on both sides, and the bathrooms are just go straight out and to your right, and you'll find them. Please note that we have 4 more programs. We always meet the first Friday of the month, and we will be meeting in March, April, May, and June. And great news, our speaker from last month, John Haveman, who spoke about immigration with wonderful charts and proof about the need for immigration. And those slides are now available online. It's really easy. You just Google LOPC / FFF lectures, and they all come up for the whole year. So if you're interested in getting more facts about last month and you missed it, you can hear it all there. Now, we will have questions and answers after Tom's talk, and so you just send them to the right or left. Someone will pick them up from our team. And please keep your questions short and legible. And we will have time, we hope, to ask Tom some questions after his lecture. Mike wanted me to point out, if you get an email about First Friday Forum and you really would rather not get it, please don't push unsubscribe, but send an email to fff@lopc.org. And I think I've pretty much covered what I need to tell you. So, Tom, would you introduce our speaker today?
Thank you, Sue. Last summer, a member of our team and a friend of Dr. Boyce, Sally Roberts, told me about his book. I immediately bought it and was absolutely captivated, and doubly delighted that you accepted our invitation to come, Dr. Boyce. It's truly remarkable to have a person who has had clinical experience working with children from neonates to adolescents, and done a ton of research on childhood development. As Sue mentioned, he is a retired distinguished Professor Emeritus from UC San Francisco. He's won a bunch of awards and honors from places such as UC Berkeley, the MacArthur Foundation, Harvard, the Canadian Institute of Advanced Research. He has many publications on very diverse areas of scientific inquiry, including such topics as what are the variables, the neurological and chemical variables of stress and how they affect the epigenetic development of human cells. He also has done work on the effects of socioeconomic status on childhood and adolescent development and so forth. So he will cover a lot of area for us, and I think although we are going to delve into science, the best way to introduce him is through poetry. Thomas Gray has some lines that go, full many a gem of darkest ray serene, the deep, unfathomed caves of ocean bare, full many a flowers born to blush unseen, and wasted sweetness on the desert air. And so our speaker today is here to reveal some of those gems to us and to make sure that every flower is recognized. Dr. Thomas Boyce.
Everybody hear me out there? Okay. Am I too loud? Okay. Well, thank you, Sue and Tom, for that nice introduction. I think I'm losing my mic here. I may need some hardware help here, but maybe not. Still hear me? Okay. I'm delighted to be at LOPC. I was at a lovely wedding here just a few weeks ago. Have an enormous number of friends who are congregants here and friends, old friends that are also here as well. And I'm going to speak today on this topic of the orchid and the dandelion, why some children struggle and how all can thrive. And the best way that I know to introduce this, really the reason I think that I was invited was because of this book that was published 5 years ago by Knopf. It's by the same title, The Orchid and the Dandelion, which is a kind of interesting metaphor that I happened upon in the course of my research. And I think the best way for me to introduce this to you is to read a little bit of the introduction to you. So I'm going to begin by reading a few passages from the introduction of the book. What if the children about whom we worry most were actually those with the greatest promise? What if those youth whose lives are marked by turmoil and difficulty were plausibly heirs to the brightest, most creative futures? What if seemingly blighted and troubled childhood could give way under conditions of encouragement and support to adulthoods bearing not simply normal lives and passable achievements, but deep, rich relationships and inspired accomplishments? What if even the very real burdens of a child's uncommon fragility could be reshaped under responsive conditions into the tangible advantages of human resilience? What if, in short, the apparent frailties and disarray of some young lives were redeemable through the alchemy of nurturing families and communities and transformative care? This book is the story of just such a surprising redemption. It is a narrative mined from a body of child development research and from a near lifetime of careful watching by a once young pediatrician who became, by blessing and luck, a father, a grandfather, and in the end, a grizzled and well-marinated counselor of children and families. The story, at once scientific and personal, is offered as a gift of encouragement and hope for all those who teach, protect, care for, raise, or worry over children, as well as those who have struggled since childhood to understand the origin of their own affliction with human differences. If your life resembles my own to any degree, you have fretted incessantly over your children's well-being and future. You have long pondered how their strivings and trials may stem from some manner of your own. You have likely thrilled at their triumphs and masteries, lived for their affections, taken pride in their accomplishments, and brooded over their troubles and sorrows. But the pain of a parent whose son or daughter has gone seriously adrift into drug abuse, delinquency, depression, or allegiances to destructive friendships is an anxiety of an entirely different order. Watching as a child strays perilously off course and begins to sustain the feared and often indelible consequences of departure from a healthy life is a kind of parental apprehension that is almost physically sensed. It's the pit in the stomach, the panicked, slightly nauseous desperation and dread that disallows sleep, becomes a preoccupation at work, and can erode even the strongest of marriages through miscommunication, acrimony, and disappointment. Watching a child slip away into the dark territory of serious psychological troubles, addiction, school failure, or criminality is an agony almost beyond description. Though never having sustained this kind of level of worry as a parent, I've had direct and indelibly memorable encounters with such anguish through much of my life because of my sister, about whom more is to follow. Among the most fervent ambitions of this book is to offer solace and hope to just such anguished families, to the parents, teachers, siblings, and others who have lost their confidence in the retrievable promise of a child or children, and to those whose belief in a child's inherent goodness and potential has been shaken. For in the story of the figures of speech from which this book draws its enigmatic title, the metaphor of orchid and dandelion children, lies a deep and often helpful truth about the origins of affliction and the redemption of individual lives. Most children in our families, classrooms, or communities are more or less like dandelions. They prosper and thrive almost anywhere they're planted. Like dandelions, these are the majority of children whose well-being is all but assured by their constitutional hardiness and strength. There are others, however, who, more like orchids, can wither and fade when unattended by caring support, but who, also like orchids, can become creatures of beauty, complexity, and elegance when met with compassion and kindness. While a conventional but arguably deficient wisdom has held that children are either vulnerable or resilient to the trials that the world presents them, what our research and that of others has increasingly revealed is that the vulnerability-resilience contrast is a false or at least misleading dualism. It is a flawed dichotomy that attributes weakness or strength, frailty or vigor to individual subgroups of youth and obscures a deeper reality that children simply differ, like orchids and dandelions, in their susceptibilities and sensitivities to the conditions of life that surround and sustain them. Most of our children can, like dandelions, thrive in all but the harshest, most bestial circumstances. But a minority of others, like orchids, either blossom beautifully or wane disappointingly, depending upon how we tend and spare and care for them. This is the redemptive secret the story herein reveals, that those orchid children who founder and fail can as easily become those who enliven and thrive in singular ways. In the end, it is not vulnerability, but sensitivity that defines the orchid. And when given the right support, that sensitivity can blossom into lives of great joy, success, and beauty. So with that, let me launch into telling you about the research that I've pursued now over about 5 decades of time telling you about where this metaphor came from, what the research is that has brought it into recognition and into a book that was published 5 years ago. So I have, for most of my life, been a sailor. I started sailing when I was probably 7 or 8 years of age down in Southern California, and have sailed all my life up until the last few recent years. And when I'm out on the San Francisco Bay or up on the Samish Sea up in the Seattle area, I'm acutely attentive to the wind direction and speed that's on the water, the surface chops and swells, the local tidal flow that comes in and out of a bay. And these are all the kind of surface conditions that a skipper of a large boat needs to be attentive to, need to be acutely aware of these surface conditions that can guide and change and can affect the course and the stability of a boat. But there are also these other currents that we think of as deep oceanic currents that flow into and out of the oceans of the world around the entire Earth, going in and out of land masses, and these powerful currents can also affect the course and the stability of a boat. And there was a French sociologist and theologian, Jacques Ellul, who said that he observed that there are these same kinds of deep oceanic currents at work within individual human lives. There are these same kinds of powerful forces that move and change the directions that we pursue, the paths that we follow, the stability of our lives. And there have been at least 2 of these deep oceanic currents in my life. The first is this one. As 50 years as a pediatrician scientist focused on children and young families facing major trauma and adversity. That's been a powerful force in my life, and one that, as I say, began 50 years ago as my research began. But the other is represented by this little snapshot of 2 young kids at a Southern California beach. You might assume that this one is me, and it is, at about age 7. And this one is my sister Mary Elizabeth, we called her Betty, at about age 5. And during the first decades of our life together, she was about 2 years younger than me, we were the best of friends. We shared curiosity, we shared various kinds of temperamental predispositions, we shared fantasies, and we were really, to each to the other, the best playmate, the foremost and most go-to playmate that the other had. But then as we both started going into puberty, our lives diverged in dramatic and in some ways tragic ways. My life became a life of almost what I would think of as almost shameful good fortune. I had a gratifying and productive professional career. I have a stable and wonderful 50-year marriage with that beautiful woman right here in the first row. We have 2 thriving children and 6 grandchildren, half here in Oakland and half in Chicago. But by contrast to that, my sister's life was very different. Her life became a life of disappointment and affliction. She developed a disabling chronic disease at the age of 11. She had a diagnosis of schizophrenia by the age of 20. While she was a graduate student at Harvard, she sustained an accidental pregnancy and delivered a disabled child. And she had a life that was characterized, at least in adulthood, by this ongoing severe mental disorder that changed forever the kinds of ways that she was able to live and raise her child. And the question that has always been a part of my life are these questions of why and how. How is it that two children raised in the same family, by the same parents, schooled in the same schools, raised in the same community, how is it that their lives can diverge so dramatically over such a short period of time? And in many ways, that's the question that my research began with and that it has pursued over now 5 decades of time. So we have been interested for many years as a society and as pediatric medicine in the etiologies of child physical and mental health disorders. And we know that there are a whole variety of forces that can affect the health of a child. There are certainly infections, most recently and most memorably COVID-19 that we all went through a few years ago. There are toxins like lead and other toxins in the environment that children can be exposed to and can exert powerful effects on their health and well-being. Diet is certainly an important factor. We know that there are differences in diet that can influence the trajectory of health for children. Healthcare certainly needs to be mentioned, but actually has less of an effect on child health, at least over the life course, than you might suspect. The character of housing that a child is brought up in, exposures to violence, and the kind of parenting that a child receives are also very important etiologic factors in determining whether a child stays healthy or begins to develop disorders of one kind or another. The one, though, that is missing from this list, and has been missing from it for most of the history of pediatric medicine, is this one: adversity and trauma. Experiences of psychological adversity and trauma that we now know, really over the last 20 to 30 years, can also powerfully affect the biology and the well-being of children and their health. And this is really the newcomer to this list. When I started doing my research in North Carolina years and years ago, I gave a grand rounds on how adversity could affect child health, and the reception was one of indignation. And how could I think that that could possibly be the case, that the things that happen in the psychological life of a child could affect actual pediatric physical disease. But we've learned a lot in the last 3 decades of time, and we now know that trauma and adversity is an important contributor to health and well-being in kids. And in fact, there is a kind of hidden epidemic of childhood trauma and adverse childhood events. These are now known as ACEs, and these are things like physical, emotional, and sexual maltreatment, intimate partner violence, community violence, parental substance abuse or mental illness, the death of a parent or caretaker, natural disasters like earthquakes and fires, as we've seen in Southern California, divorce and single parenthood, parent incarceration, poverty and unemployment, and racism and social subordination, the marginalization of families. All of these are adverse childhood experiences that can have powerful effects on a child's well-being. And it turns out that these adverse events are highly prevalent within populations of children. And we now know that 2/3 of kids represented by these little dark figures have experienced a potentially traumatic event or adversity by the age of 16. We also know that these are not spread evenly across the population of children within any given community. We know that socioeconomic status, poverty versus middle income, has profound effects on the experiences of these various adverse childhood events. So when we compare children growing up in middle-class families to children growing up in poverty as you can see, in the density of the surrounding population and housing that children experience, housing problems, noise, family turmoil, and violence, all are far more prevalent in the lives of impoverished children compared to those of children from middle-class families. So a tremendous imbalance in the things that children from impoverished families versus middle-class families are exposed to. And these have powerful consequences, these adverse childhood experiences. This shows one such association. This is depression disorders by ACEs scores. This is lifetime history of depression and depressive disorders on the vertical axis, and on the horizontal axis, a count of the number of ACEs experienced during the life of a child. And as you can see, there is this kind of stepwise increase in depression and mood disorders as children go from no ACEs exposures to 5 or greater. So a powerful association with depression and mental disorder. There's also evidence that significant adversity impairs development in the first 3 years of life. So if we look now on the vertical axis of percent of children with developmental delays as a function of the number of ACEs experienced during childhood, you can see again that there is this stepwise linear association with those children with high numbers of ACEs having far more in the way of developmental delay. And it isn't limited to just childhood. We also know that the odds of developing cardiovascular risk factors in adulthood is also linearly and positively related to ACEs scores, with those with the greatest number of ACEs experienced in childhood having much more risk of cardiovascular disease, coronary disease, valvular disease, and so on. We even know, although we can't look at the neurons of the brains of children with varying amounts of ACEs exposures, we can in laboratory animals. And this shows the way that a neuron looks in the brain of an unexposed, relatively controlled environment mouse. And you compare that to the way that a neuron looks in a young mouse that has been exposed to early stress of one kind or another. And what you see is that there is diminished and simplified branching of this neuron. There's a decrease in attachment points along the course of the neuronal axis. And there's a shrinkage of the neuronal cell bodies of stressed animals compared to non-stressed animals. So, powerful effects on a whole variety of mental and physical health outcomes that these exposures entail. But hidden within these associations that I've been showing you is a little secret that is important for you to know about. This is one of the associations that I showed you a few slides ago, lifetime history of depression increasing as ACEs scores increase. But what the bar graph doesn't show you is what the actual data points look like that underlie that bar graph. And this is what that looks like when you strip it down to what the actual data points look like in the association between mood disorders and ACEs in childhood. And you can see that it's a tremendous variation. There are kids who have relatively low numbers of ACEs, or high numbers of ACEs but low depressive scores. There are kids who have low numbers of ACEs but have lots of depression and mood disorder symptoms. So there's this tremendous variation over the course of this linear association. The underlying association is definitely there, but it looks like a shotgun hit the screen. Lots of variation. And my colleagues and I began years ago asking the question, is this variation that we see in these associations, is it noise? Are we just seeing noise in the linkage between developmental outcomes and adversity? Or might it actually be the music? Might it be the very thing that we ought to be attending to? And so we began a number of years ago taking the second of these two options and exploring whether there might be something about this variation which is in fact the key to understanding the underlying associations. This shows a little girl in a laboratory setting. She's seated in front of an examiner that she's never met before. The examiner is asking her to do relatively challenging, mildly stressful tasks, things like watching a movie clip that has an emotion-evoking quality to it, listening to a series of digits and asking the child to repeat those digits back, putting a drop of lemon juice on her tongue. All of these are mildly stressful but definitely evocative kinds of tasks that the children in our laboratory were exposed to. Not terrible stress, but each of these tasks mildly challenging. And while they were doing these tasks, we measured the response in the two principal stress response systems of the human and child brain, which are the cortisol system, which is centered in these two nuclei in the hypothalamus, the arcuate and the paraventricular nucleus, and the fight or flight system, which is centered in this little nucleus in the brainstem called the locus ceruleus, which sends projections up into the hypothalamus and ignites the fight or flight system. So cortisol is the classic stress hormone. It affects the immune system, it affects the cardiovascular system, has powerful effects on all of those systems. The fight or flight system is the one that we're familiar with when we're giving a public talk or when we're meeting somebody for the first time. It's the rapid pulse and the dilation of pupils and all of those fight or flight kinds of symptoms and signs that we're all aware of when we're confronting a novel situation. So this was in the laboratory, and we had peripheral measures of both of these systems, the cortisol system and the locus ceruleus norepinephrine system, in the laboratory. And here's what we found. We found that 80% of these children that we examined, when they went through these challenging tasks, this shows the baseline and tasks 1 through 5, and we measure some kind of a physiologic parameter that reflects these two stress response systems, in this case, mean arterial pressure. You can see that there's a little bit of an increase in blood pressure as they go through these relatively stressful tasks, but there's not a lot. There's not a lot of variability. There's a little bit of an ascent, but not anything major. So this was what it looks like for 80% of the kids that we examined. For 20% of the kids, by contrast, when they went through the same challenging tasks, first of all, their blood pressures were higher and much more variable. These were kids who had tremendous variation in heart rate, in cortisol secretion, in blood pressure, all of which were related to these two stress response systems in their brains. 80% and 20%. So we now had measures of children's stress responsivity within very controlled, very standardized, very replicable laboratory circumstances. So we wanted then now to take these laboratory measures, take them into the real world, and study how children's outcomes and illnesses, how they fared in real-world circumstances where they encounter stresses and challenges. So here we've taken it now to the real world, where kids are confronted with hostile playmates, with parental conflict, with a whole variety of actual real-world stressors that are far more powerful and significant than those that we administered in the laboratory. And we began then measuring under conditions of low stress versus high stress, naturally occurring high stress. We began measuring the incidence of behavioral disorders of one kind or another, of respiratory diseases, injuries, so a whole variety of pediatric health outcomes ranging from more mental health kinds of consequences to more physical health kinds of reflections of the stress that they might be under. And here's what we found. We found that 80% of kids who had relatively low magnitude laboratory reactivity to stressors, sure enough, in real life circumstances, under high stress conditions, they had a little bit of an increase in these behavioral and physical disorders, but it wasn't dramatic. There was a little bit, and it was significantly different, but it was not dramatic. By contrast to that, the kids who in the laboratory had shown this highly variable and elevated levels of stress response reactivity under conditions of high stress had this substantial increase, very significant increase, even over those in other children with this kind of a profile, much greater than their response to high stress in the kids who had this highly variable profile in the lab. So this was really what we expected. We expected that in the real world, these reactivity measures that we were assessing within the laboratory setting would be reflected in much greater illness and injury and behavioral disorders in the real world. What we hadn't expected, though, is this: that these same kids who looked like this in the laboratory, when they were existing and growing and being reared under relatively low stress, relatively predictable conditions, they didn't just have the same level of stress or of disorder as the kids from the relatively unreactive group. They had much lower. So these were kids who had either the worst outcomes or the best outcomes, depending upon the psychosocial circumstances under which they were living and coping. So either the best outcomes or the worst outcomes. I was presenting these data down at Stanford one time, years ago, and an old Swedish guy, a physician with a cane, came wobbling up the aisle and pointed his cane at me and said, "You're talking about Maskrosbarn." And I said, "Maskrosbarn? What is Maskrosbarn?" He said, "The Swedes have an idiomatic expression, Maskrosbarn, which has the meaning in Swedish of dandelion child. These are kids who can grow and thrive under almost any circumstance, like the dandelion. The dandelion can grow in the cracks of sidewalks, it can grow in fertile fields, it can grow in vertical walls. You see dandelions everywhere because they are able to thrive in a whole variety of different conditions, from welcoming and nurturant to hostile." So we said, well, that's interesting. So Maskrosbarn. So we started thinking of these kids as dandelion children. And of course, we had to go on and develop the Swedish neologism of Orchidbarn, or orchid child. So we began thinking of these kids, the highly reactive lab profiles, as being orchids, and these kids with the more resilient lab profile as dandelions. And we went on to be able to study this in a whole variety of laboratory animals, ranging from Drosophila melanogaster, the fruit fly with that ugly face, to a variety of different monkey and primate species. And I had the great good fortune one year, years ago, to go to the NIH and spend a year studying monkeys under stressful and non-stressful circumstances. So let me tell you a little bit about that one study and what we found. We were studying a group of rhesus macaques, about 60 of them, who lived in a 6-acre natural enclosure, a natural habitat. It was a nice big area. It was surrounded, of course, by fence, but it had, as you can see in this photo, a pond. It had a whole variety of monkey toys that were available and accessible to these individuals. It had a little bridge that went over to a little island in the pond. So it was like a summer camp for monkeys. And they loved living there. But right before we arrived in Bethesda, something dramatic had happened, which was that there were some renovations and revisions that needed to be made in this 6-acre habitat. And for that, the monkeys needed to be confined for a period of 1 or 2 months in a 200 to 300 square foot cinder block building. So imagine 60 monkeys in a little apartment space. It was very, very stressful. And of course, the confinement that these animals sustained, like all construction, didn't go on for 1 or 2 months. It went on for 3 or 4 months. So this was a period of dramatic, intense stress in the lives of this troop of rhesus monkeys. And we were able to study that, partly because we knew, even before this all started to happen, we knew the reactivity status of these animals. We knew what their behavior was like. We knew what their physiology was like. And they also had been categorized into reactive and non-reactive animals. Here's what we found. When we looked at violent injuries that the animals sustained under the low-stress, quiescent, normal circumstances in which they lived most of the time, they both had low levels of violent injuries. In contrast to that, once they went into confinement, there was this huge increase in violent injuries, really for both the reactive and non-reactive animals. But you can see that here again, there were dandelion and orchid animals. These were the highly reactive monkeys, and they had either the lowest rates of violent injuries under conditions of non-stress, and they had the highest numbers of injuries under conditions of confinement and challenge. So a replication within a very related, highly genetically similar species that showed the same kind of phenomenon of the orchid animals having either the worst outcomes or the best outcomes, depending upon the kind of circumstances in which they were living. So we have called this differential neurobiologic susceptibility to social context. It's about the sensitivity of the neurobiology of the animals and children to the social context in which they are reared. And we've been able to study this at a whole variety of different levels, from the temperament and the behavior of kids to the cortisol system and the fight or flight reactivity that I showed you in the laboratory. We've been able to look at it in brain circuitry, synapses and cells, and we've even been able to study it at the level of genes and the epigenome. So let me show you a bit about that. Who are the orchid and dandelion children? What do these kids look like if you just met them on a playground or in a family or in a home? The dandelion children are often extroverted. They're comfortable with novel situations. They respond well to novelty and challenge. They have average health in both low and high stress settings. Contrast to that, the kids who are the orchid children are often, though not universally, shy. They tend to withdraw from novelty. They don't like going into novel circumstances. They have a lot of sensory sensitivities, like not wanting there to be wrinkles in their socks inside the shoes. Or they may have taste aversions or noise aversions that they have a good deal of trouble coping with. And they have this phenomenon of having either the best or worst health outcomes, depending upon context. So they display this kind of spectrum of sensitivity to the social world, anchored in the poles of the orchid child and the dandelion child, but really a spectrum over a whole range of responsivity and sensitivity to the world. So where do orchids come from? Here's a dad saying to his newborn son, how do you want to play this, nature, nurture, or a bit of both? And it turns out that it is, as you might expect, a bit of both. Where do they come from? They come first from differences in genetics. We all know that the sequence of bases in the DNA chain vary from one to another. There are differences even within sibships in genetic variation. And we know now that there are risk profiles, genetic risk profiles, that characterize highly reactive, highly sensitive children and in animals as well. But DNA is interesting because it's like books that are packed in a box. You have to take the books out of the box and open them in order to read them. And genes are the same way. You have to unpack them in order to allow them to express themselves in the protein differences that come from that DNA and change the character of the individual. But there are also clearly effects of families on who becomes an orchid and who becomes a dandelion child. It is a kind of combination of nature and nurture. It is the nature of the genetic differences, but the nurture of the family differences that kids experience. And this leads to our studies of the epigenome, which is the matrix of chemical tags that lie on top of the DNA and control the level of expression of those various genes. So that epigenome controls whether the genes are relatively tightly packed, in which case it's very hard for the enzymes that decode the DNA to get to them. It's hard to read those books. Or unpacked, where the book is open and the gene can actually be read. And it turns out that what determines that packing or unpacking are these little chemical tags that lie along the course on top of the genome, and those we know now are related to the character of the family environment that the kids experience. So it's the family environment that regulates whether the genetic differences that we see in children are expressed or not expressed. So this is where this epigenome is where the external world actually touches the biological self. So we've had a lot of experience clinically now with kids who have a more orchid profile and kids who have a more dandelion profile. And we found some regularities in what are the characteristics of families that allow an orchid child to thrive. And let me just go through what some of these are. First is that the family is willing to recognize and allow the child to express his or her own true self, this sense of who I am as an individual child, the degree to which that is allowed to be expressed within the family. Routines and sameness. Orchid children seem to respond very beneficially to the kind of patterning and predictability of life within a family. Caritas, the Latin word for compassion and steadfast love, the degree to which the family showers that child with the love and the care that every child needs. Human differences between children within a sibship, are those celebrated or are those kind of obscured, as if they're not relevant, they're not wanted? Imaginative play. Kids, we think of play as, sort of a frivolous activity of childhood, but it is not. It is an important moderator of these associations between Orchid versus Dandelion and physical and mental health outcomes. And finally, danger. One of the biggest challenges for parents of Orchid children is what to do when the child says, I don't want to go to that birthday party. Then you're faced with this dilemma of do I urge the child on, allowing him or her to potentially experience this triumph of actually going to something that he or she doesn't want to go to and finding that she can cope with being at the birthday party, or do you allow them to withdraw? And that is a dilemma that comes up repeatedly, week after week, in the families of Orchid children. And these 5 or 6 characteristics have the nice coincidence of forming an anagram of Orchid: own true self, routines, caritas, human differences, imaginative play, and danger. So let me summarize like this. Children's health is not just affected by bugs and bad water. Psychological adversities, as we now well know, maltreatment, parental conflict, community violence, poverty and racism, can impair health and can even impede brain development. And children are not equal in their susceptibility to those kinds of exposures. Secondly, kids fall into 2 broad categories of susceptibility: a majority that, like dandelions, thrive under most conditions, and a small minority that, like orchids, are especially sensitive to both good rearing conditions and bad. They have this phenomenon of the worst outcomes or the best outcomes. These differences in susceptibility are due to the combined developmental effects of genes and very early environments, a combination of nature, nurture, and time, developmental time, and they seem to arise epigenetically through environmental signals that regulate the expression of inherited genetic differences. So someone at some point said that every photograph is a kind of self-portrait, in the sense that when somebody takes a picture, that they're putting something of themselves into it, that the things that we tend to pursue or take pictures of or focus on within our lives are affected by who we are at the core. And of course, for me, that has been very much the case, that the things that I decided to study and pursued over many years of time harken back to the things that I experienced in early life. And by the way, I didn't really realize this connection until years and years into my research career. It was very late in life where I began to see that the things that I was studying were intimately connected to the things that I had experienced as a young child with my sister. So these questions that I began with of why, how is it that 2 kids take such dramatically different trajectories over the life course? Well, there's a whole variety of answers to that, but some of them are that there are unshared family environments. Siblings within a given family are actually raised in different families. The experience that I had of my family was very different from the experience that my sister had of our family. Sibling differences in genetic risk. There were almost certainly genetic differences between the 2 of us that played out in very dramatic and to some degree tragic ways. Differences in birth order. I was firstborn, I was male, she was female. And probably epigenetic interactions between the genetic variation between the two of us and the unshared family environment that the two of us experienced. So if you will forgive me for a moment, it doesn't escape me that we are meeting this afternoon in a beautiful house of worship. And we are challenged in this country at the moment with a tremendous dilemma. Our lives and our communities, our neighborhoods, our friendships are replete with experiences of vulnerability, of poverty, of threat. And we have an obligation, I think, to think carefully about how we respond to that vulnerability in the same way that parents have an obligation to think about the variation in vulnerability of the children in their sibship. If this cross means anything, it points us toward the sanctity of vulnerability and of being a refugee, of being a people that are afflicted to some degree, and in some communities, of people that are tormented. And I think we have to be thinking as believers, as I am, and as probably many of you are, we need to be thinking about how we now respond to the vulnerability that we see within our communities. So, last slide, two pieces of news that I hope you might remember. One is that the children about whom we worry most are sometimes those with the most remarkable promise. And secondly, that under conditions of support and care, troubled childhoods are transformable, and they can become lives of enduring health, positive development, and astonishing achievement. And I will stop there, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Tom.
Thank you, Sue.
And I loved your example of the monkeys and, having 6 acres to flourish,
Yeah.
and then all confined, and how they became violent. And we know that we have that
Monkeys are
example with people. So many young people come from impoverished areas and have had traumatic experiences,
Yeah.
right? So I know many of you have been passing your questions, and unfortunately it appears it's not working online, the questions, and I apologize for that. But those of you who are here, you have an opportunity to ask Tom questions. And before we get to that, I just want to thank the team. I want to thank Kevin Miller, our tech man up there, and Catherine Coleman, Judy Nielsen, Sally Roberts, Mike Rusk, our team leader, Tom Scoville, Tom Weaver, and Joe Whitehouse for making this possible. And, what you told really rings for us, because we had a schizophrenic son that I was not even able to talk about until recently. And we had dandelions, 3 of them who thrived, and then we had a son that we had trouble understanding. So,
Yeah,
thank you.
I hear you.
So we can, Tom is going to come up and read the questions.
Tom, I have a question first. Would you mind if I pulled a chair up here and sat? No, I'll do it, but it'll just be a little easier. Okay, fire away, Tom.
And we are happy to give you the endowed chair of childhood pediatrics.
Thank you.
It is yours for at least 20 minutes. So lots of good questions. The that are prompted by a great talk. Thank you, Tom. So lots of good questions from a great talk. Thank you, Tom. The first one, how do you best help an Orchid child to be set up for success? How do we invigorate the Orchid child's confidence and decrease the preferences for familiar or program situations and activities?
Yeah, well, this basically the question is how do we ensure that the Orchid children in our families and communities thrive instead of go into the kinds of more undesirable outcomes that we know are possible for them. And it really goes back to that little anagram of Orchid. Those are the 6 characteristics of families that we've observed clinically seem to have Orchid children who are thriving and are really blossoming in their lives. So, it's providing lots of opportunity for play, not just screen time, but play. Providing the kind of enduring, sustaining, steadfast love that we all aspire to as parents and as grandparents, but is exquisitely important to kids who are more susceptible, more sensitive to their environments. And all of those various characteristics of those families would be things that I think we would want to ensure for kids who have this more sensitive phenotype, more sensitive persona.
And the follow-up, of course, is how do you help a dandelion child thrive without inadvertently fostering oppositional social disorder and conduct problems?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, it's not that Orchid children are invulnerable, impenetrable. Orchid children can have problems and difficulties and can get sick, just like Orchid children can. It's a different flavor of disorder often because the dandelion child is much more outward and extroverted and is prone to disorders that have to do with impulsivity and sometimes hyperactivity. So these are the kids who we can't keep a cap on. They're all the time going for it. And some of the same things, of course, that are encouraging to Orchid children are also encouraging to dandelion children as well. So, for example, if we take the element of family routines, the sustainable rhythms of life within a family are good for all children. Caritas, that characteristic of compassion and steadfast love, those are needed not just by Orchid children, but by dandelion children as well. It's just that Orchid children seem to be more sensitive to those effects than dandelion children. So it's not that there's a whole separate set of positive, beneficial factors within families that dandelion children need to experience in contrast to Orchid children. It's that they are relatively more sort of self-motivated, self-guiding, and seem to do better in the longer term.
Thank you. You hinted at this in your talk, but could you elaborate on how birth order affects outcomes?
Yeah.
And also, how do years between children affect outcomes?
How, what between children?
The age between children affect
okay.
outcomes.
Yeah. Well, I think we're all familiar with these characteristic differences in kids from different birth orders. But again, the message here is that it's highly variable. So with my sister and me, I was first in the birth order, she was second in the birth order. And actually, there was a third, my little brother. So she became the middle child. And we know that there are sort of characteristic personality types that we associate loosely with birth order, like firstborn kids seeming to be kids who are very oriented toward ambition and accomplishment and leadership. Middle kids being troubled in some ways, and the youngest kids being babied in certain ways. But I think the main thing to know is that when we look at these laboratory profiles of reactive and less reactive children, that there are no differences by gender. Boys and girls are equally likely to fall into the Dandelion versus the Orchid category. There are no differences by birth order. There are certainly no differences by ethnicity. So mostly those kind of demographic factors that distinguish between kids don't seem to play out in terms of their responsivity to both good and bad environments. Thank you.
Would you consider bullying to be an adverse childhood event?
I'm going to have you repeat that one, Tom.
Yeah. Would you consider bullying to be an adverse childhood event?
Absolutely. Absolutely. You may have seen that when I switched from the laboratory to the real life little icon above those data, that I had sort of a bullying circumstance that was being played out there. Bullying is a powerful and unfortunately effective force on the well-being and the growth and development of children, and we need to be doing all that we can to prevent bullying, both within families where it also can occur, but also in schools and preschools and so on. We also have studied social hierarchies in children, in 3 to 5-year-old children, and we find that there are these same kinds of stratifications of the society of a preschool or a kindergarten as there are within the adult society. And there is a tendency within these hierarchies for the kids who are more reactive to funnel to the bottom of those hierarchies and to be more often bullied because they're good targets. They don't come back. They don't resist the abuse of the bullies in their social environments.
Thank you. Your research is tremendous. Has it affected policies related to care and health of children? If so, how and where?
Is there social policy?
The affected policies, whatever, of, I assume, government policies related to care and health of children.
Yeah. Kevin, if you're still up there, if I could go back to my slide deck, I want to show you one more slide. So here's an interesting phenomenon. This slide shows educational level in years going from preschool to university. And the two y-axes, the vertical axes, on one hand is mean educator salary, and the other is the brain's capacity for learning through experience. This line is the brain's capacity this line is the line for the brain's capacity to learn through experience, and this is the line defining differences in teacher salary. So isn't this interesting? The teachers that we pay the least, that we require the least of in terms of educational and training experience, are those that are tasked with the care of the sponges, the little kids who have the greatest capacity for learning and changing their development and their capacities for a good life. In contrast to that, the kids who are really, they're nearing the nadir of their ability to learn through experience, these are the teachers that we pay the most. I'm not trying to get us to do pay cuts for high school teachers and professors, but my point here is that we haven't fully, as a society, invested where the money really is, where the money is for child development and child well-being. It's in those early years. It's in the first 3 years of life that everything is being formed, that so much is determinative to later life well-being. And I really am convinced that we need to put far more investment as a society into the well-being and the pay and the attraction of the teachers who address our young children, not just those that address high school students and college students. So that would be an example, Tom, of a social policy that could be changed. There'd be a lot of resistance to it, but it makes eminent sense, I think.
I blush to admit I was a university professor and my wife was a high school teacher. Fortunately, we were paid just about the same amount, but she deserved her money. Mine was a hobby. My Orchid granddaughter was diagnosed with Asperger's autism when age 3. Family was loving, supportive. Later in college, became a trans mom, and now seems to be thriving as a dandelion. So is there a relationship between being autistic and being gender fluid? That's an easy question.
Yeah. Not that I know of.
Thank you.
But
Yeah.
But let me just say that this is an example of an individual that could be very easily marginalized in our society, pushed to the edge, neglected, disregarded, disapproved of. And yet, here's a person who has risen in her life to being able to do some wonderful things. And I meant what I said about the critical importance of us attending to the marginal, those that are pushed out, those that are hungry and thirsty, and that are being maltreated in all kinds of different ways, not by individuals, but by our society at the moment.
Thank you. How do we support parents of adopted children who, as years unfold, sometimes learn they have an orchid child, especially as with a new administration, there are restrictions for special education and other programs?
Yeah. Again, same message. There are families now that are worrying about whether their child is going to get a free lunch at school because they can't afford to send them to school with a lunch. There are families who are worrying that their Head Start program will be discontinued. There are families, of course, that are worrying about deportation and separation of the family, of the child from the parent. All of these are societal issues that I think we have to confront with a humble heart and with strong intention to do right by our children.
Here's a question about bipolar illness, rapid cycles, that actually led to a older sister taking her life. Do you have any comments about bipolar illness and its effects?
Well, it's one of the major psychiatric disorders. It can begin in adolescence, continue throughout the life course. I recently had the experience of an acquaintance talking about the depression in his sister that has profoundly affected her life in recent weeks. And this was in a group of people who were talking about this, and someone asked, well, is it only depression? And I think we have a built-in societal predisposition to think of mental disorder and disturbance as somehow lesser and non-physical and less legitimate than if that individual had rheumatoid arthritis or breast cancer or a serious infection. But I think what our research has shown, and I hope I've convinced you of, is that these things all clump together, and mental disorder is just as physical in the psychobiologic sense as any of these disorders that we think of as chronic physical diseases are. So we need to be taking all of them seriously. Mental disorder has a powerful, powerful effect on individual lives, on families, on societies, on communities.
Thank you very much, Tom. There are many more questions, but we don't want to keep you all day and appreciate your talk. Sue will come up and conclude our time together. Thank you very much,
Thank you,
Dr.
Tom.
Boyce. Thank
Thanks.
you.
Yes, thank you again, Tom.
you,
That
Sue.
was so interesting. And thank you all for coming. I have to announce that we just found out yesterday that Robert Todd, who was going to speak about AI next month, is, for family reasons, is unable to come. Needless to say, we need a little more time to replace him, but I promise you we'll have another very interesting speaker, and I hope you all return again on the first Friday of March. Thank you again for coming.